Constantly, on the Sunday Tangbe, so the new one to Shushoshi. Then Delia, Garantu, Charlie, Shunalolia, and the Tokyo Nami, the same is not like you, and the Jewish occasion that the Yaving Sherry saying. Any and the day, and then to come up pitching Natuchi, Marchiga, House on this one's again, Julia, to the Tula Tang Man, and Mount Pass, walking the water. Doing the Lamsang, Bozu Shache, any, and then come and you shoot in here, any. Delhi, John Nilulonia Kangi, Buname Roma, Chimurine, Europe Hunzo Tang, Yanaki, John Mi Tokanto, Tatsutan, Tebegin, Joshi Depolia, EU and China human rights perspectives and its impacts on Tibet issue, Dekania, and common issue, common organization.
This paper cautions the EU's role in making Chinese authority comply with universal human rights rules. This paper will look into different views of EU and China on issues of human rights. It will discuss current situation of human rights in China, taking case of Tibet, and also EU's position on human rights. It will also analyze the shift in the ways in which EU formulates human rights policy towards China and how it has changed over the time. It will also further caution the effectiveness of EU in promoting human rights in China. If we look at the historical development of EU-China human rights, EU-China relations, the relationship has been characterized by the phases of agreement and cooperation as well as differences and tensions. Both EU-China gained an important position in international relations over the past decades, especially in economic terms. The relationship, diplomatic relationship established in 1975 is based on the Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement 1985, and it has been matured and transformed from comprehensive partnership to comprehensive strategic partnership in 2003. Currently, China has become one of most important strategic partners of EU among Asian states, and China became the second largest trading partner of EU, both in export and economic. While EU as China's second largest trading partner ahead of US and Japan, 2015 marked 40th anniversary of their bilateral relation. However, the question of human rights has been one of the most difficult and delicate areas in their relationship. If you look at EU's perspective on human rights, institution of human rights assumes a prestige position in international relations, and human rights, democracy, rule of law are core values of EU, and also EU believes that promotion and protection of human rights around the world is a legitimate concern, and also they are committed to promote human rights in China in an active, sustained, and constructive manner. There are two important factors for contemplating such issue as a strategic importance. First, EU is a Nobel Peace Laureate and also normative power. Human rights has become value of honor for them. And secondly, they have created an idea of creating China as a safe place for the EU's future investment, and therefore successful democratization and opening our Chinese market to the world has been their most objective. If you look at China and human rights, China's discourse on human rights, for China, right to individual is not inherent, rather based or given by the state for privileged ones. It does not believe in universal definition of human rights. That is, in human rights, right to every individual is equal and inalienable. It is fair to say that human rights as a discourse does not exist in China pre-1970s. The political dominant discourse back then was class struggle, and there's a slightly change in political parties' policy after 1970s. Their focus has shifted from class struggle to economic reconstruction and opening up of Chinese society to the world. And however, there's a less improvement in the front of political rights because PRC being an overwhelming realist, and there's less devoted to improvement of human rights, especially in China and Tibet. If you look at the situation of human rights in China, human rights abuse has reached forefront of international concern after 1989 Tiananmen Square, and China faced unprecedented international pressures, and the major issues of concern like repression of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from discrimination, freedom from thought, all these political rights continue to exist, and China always counter-argue this argument with the cultural relativism theory, and in fact, recently in 2015, the Chinese right group said human rights situation is currently the worst, and also Li Fui stated that human rights situation is getting more brutal and more inhuman. Even in Tibet, it's almost same and it's worse. Over 140 Tibetans have self-immolated to show the discontentment of repressive rule in Tibet. In this case, if you look at the EU's position on human rights, especially in case of Tibet, human rights advocates argue that political situation in Tibet makes different from rest of China because Chinese occupation in Tibet led to cultural and physical genocide. And also EU accept that China is one of worst human rights record, and also especially in Tibet, certainly degree of protection of individual human rights is still significantly lower than one is entitled to, and EU's major condemnation of human rights situation in Tibet, China, is imposing arms embargo sanctions after Tiananmen Square, and also European Parliament has expressed and issued different institutions, provided guidelines on human rights, initiated human rights dialogue, laid down human rights policies towards China, and also they have expressed their support on different occasions, such as passing resolution statements, annual report, also hearings on Tibet. Also, European Parliament reiteratedly call on Council to appoint an EU representative for Tibet, and also root cause of unrest and foster dialogue between the Tibet and China. However, China denies to do so. That if you look at the effectiveness of EU's human rights policy towards China, despite EU strategy of constructive engagement based on cooperation and dialogue over human rights issues in China, human rights records had worsened over the time. And it is clear that also EU has made it clear on several occasions that it wanted to make dialogues more result-oriented and reinforce their stance and not weaken. Also, European leaders issue statements saying that they will not accept Beijing's imposition of restrictions on their meetings with political and religious figures, including His Holiness. However, China has EU has never issued any alternative policies or method to sending their support on human rights. Rather, the human rights diplomacy has in general remain limited to issuing contemporary declarations, and there are several reasons. If you look at EU-China Human Rights Dialogue, which was initiated in 1995, and its major objective was to have open the communication between them on different issues, but it also prioritized China's ratification of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China declined to ratify, and despite continuous pressure on them, for me at least there is a less probability to improve political rights even if China rectifies IICR. Irony is that in spite of ratification of Convention Against Torture over 16 years ago, torture remains a problem for them. Therefore, outcome of dialogue have never resulted in serious action plan to improve human rights situation in Tibet. Therefore, the dialogue has been taken behind the closed door and also between a low-level diplomat, and it does not make much difference to individuals. It also another reason China's behavior, because whenever EU's stand on Tibet or human rights has been criticized by China, arguing that it's a Western diplomacy to gain economic concession from China, and also when it comes to human rights, also they use the cultural relativism theory, and China also consider Tibet as a core issue and domestic issue. That's why they does not bear the foreign intervention in human rights in China's case. There's also economic, EU's diplomatic relationship with His Holiness also resulted in cancellation of high diplomatic relations and also a few summits. I'll not go into details. And there's also economic reasons and exponential growth of Chinese economy in the world. They have become economic major power, and not only EU, other major international community has become less critical for China's violation of human rights. There's also greater significance between their relationship in the backdrop of economic crisis, because EU seeks Chinese help to bail out Greece from Eurozone crisis, and also China agreed to do so. Also, EU's participation in One Belt, One Road project also has a benefit from EU, and China leaders expect EU to be respectful and less critical about the issues. Therefore, EU becomes overcautious. And there's also division within member states. There's a division within member states in economic interest versus core values, because major members like France, Germany, they have a stronger economic relationship with China, and moreover Scandinavian, Norway, they mostly focus on core values such as human rights and rules of law. In terms of arms embargo as well, the major France, Germany, they agreed to uplift arms embargo from China, and with the criticism from Scandinavian countries and UK, US, arms embargo still persists. There's also division within 1997 UN Human Rights Council. There's a division between these bigger states and smaller states, and this critical resolution towards China has been co-sponsored by UK, Denmark, and Netherlands, which was voted against by France and other 4 member states, and which resulted that no more critical resolution would be taken following United Nations Human Rights Council Human Rights. As a result, there's also incohesiveness between EU institutions as well. European Parliament is again, they support more on human rights issues, and European Council, whereas it mostly deals with economic relationship with China, and they are suffer towards China, and they also stated that EU should no longer exercise any restraint on China's human rights and citizen issues. From these studies, it became evident that China's human rights policy towards China, EU's human rights policy towards China is ineffective, particularly in Tibet, and the gulf between EU's human rights rhetoric and reality evidently has not yet breached. As a result, economic competition and conflicting national interests continue to restrict EU's foreign policy on human rights issues to a mere declarations rather than actions. Also, because of incohesiveness of EU member states, institutions, China's behavior, sensitive issues such as human rights in Tibet is likely to further marginalize, and also pressure for EU authorities to grow in future. Therefore, as a result of overcautious approach of EU, human rights situation is less likely to improve in China, especially in Tibet. I personally think that changes should come from within Chinese government, not then only human rights situation would improve gradually, if not instantly. It is evident that China is not likely to respond to any outside pressures. Thank you.
First, when we say norms, it immediately comes to our mind that it has something to do with rules, standards, principles that tells us what ought to be done and what ought not to be done, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So let us start by saying that norms are essentially a judgment made on what is right and what is wrong, to put it simply. It can be defined as standards of appropriate behavior for international actors and international organizations and those bound by the international norms. On this, Anne J. Weiner has, according to her, international organizations can be described as a hard institution, and norms, rules, and regulations, principles are defined as soft institutions. They are called soft institutions because norms are usually contested. And significant studies have also found out that norms really matter because they guide politics and laws in international realm in a very distinct ways. Of course, there are a lot of discussions, debates on norms has become quite a popular intellectual field of study recently, and especially considered in the international relations, because norms are identified as a guiding behavior by providing motivations for action. They are believed to guide action in more direct and meaningful ways. So it is more or less accepted that norms do matter and that it has taken a social constructivist turn. So now when I talk about a social constructivism in understanding norms, we come across why norms matter and how it has been studied and understood in academic world, especially by the international relations scholars. Most interestingly, academicians have observed that the role of norms and culture in international relations has posed direct challenge to the realist and liberal theories, which are the two most dominant theories in international relations. And because of the limitations seen in these two dominant international relations, a new theory, a social constructivism, came up and effectively and adequately captured the significance and influence of norms, values, and ideas. Social constructivism is known to have its roots in philosophy and sociology that answers many aspects of international relations that theories like no-realist and realist do not. And since these theories like realism have based their ideas on materialist view, tend to understand the international relations and international politics to be primarily driven by power and national interest, and that they define states' power just by their military capability, economic and their resources and national security. However, this kind of argument has been taken differently by constructivist view, who tend to understand international system quite differently, where material power and states just do not define states' interest. Constructivist view that constructivist understands that ideas and social interaction form the interaction between international organizations and ideas. They kind of influence more on the national interest of a state, on which Alexander Wendt, who is one of the most prominent figure on constructivist theory, denies neorealist point on anarchic state of international system that will let state to rely on their self-help. He states that, in fact, he states that interaction between state produces identities and interest of state. And Martha Fine-Moore noted that societies even plays more important role by teaching state what their national policies should be, because states' behavior are defined by identity and interest, and these are defined by international forces, and those forces are defined by international societies. Thus, we can say that the interstate interaction and international societies define policies of the state. In the interest of better understanding, Anne J. Weiner has distinguished three types of norms, known as fundamental norms, organizing principles, and standardized procedures. And she has distinguished these three types according to their respective degrees of generalization, specification, and contestation on ethical grounds, on which the first point, the fundamental norms, include core constitutional norms which are commonly applied in the international relations theory. They basically include examples like citizenship, human rights, rule of law, democracy, sovereignty, non-intervention and abstention from torture, and so forth. These kind of norms are understood to be more contested compared to the other norms. The second norms, organizing principles, are closely linked with the political process, and they evolve through process of policy making. Example like accountability, responsibility, transparency, and gender mainstreaming and legitimacy. These are much lesser contested compared to fundamental norms. And finally, the least contested norms are standardized procedure that involves specific prescriptions and rules and regulations. And these kind of norms are least likely to be contested on moral and ethical grounds. They involve, for example, electoral rules, assembly regulations, unanimous decision, and representation. So it follows logically that the most contested norms are the fundamental norms, which can be further reflected in the normative contestation between China and West. Now, when we talk about China, we observe that China continues to rise as a global power. So it naturally becomes necessary for China to accumulate and produce its own soft power of ideas, values, and norms. And China certainly comes out to be a global player and is likely to be accepted as one of the most important international actors. So if it's true, what kind of, the question is, what kind of world power will China be? And more importantly, would it likely to accommodate itself to the existing system of norms? Or will Chinese government insist on reshaping international system for its own image and in its own favor? So before we clear out all these queries, let us find out what is China's idea on norms and how it is being contested with the Western notion of norms. Well, the idea of norms in China can be found in historical discourses of ancient Chinese thinkers like in the Mencius thought, in which Tochi in his article states that Mencius did not believe in common people's participation in the political process, since he believed that people are ill-equipped and they lack necessary education and training, thereby depriving individual of their political identity, political right. Similarly, on the same ground, Tu Yingtang, a Chinese professor and a philosopher, has argued that Confucianism, which is today one of the most dominant discourse in China, demands that virtue and duty should go together, and that duties of a ruler include authority and right to perform their duties for the benefits of their subjects. Although right is a recognized value of Confucianism, it has certainly failed to place the individual right before duties. Likewise, the traditional mandate of heaven, which is probably the oldest form of ruling system in China, also brings political power as a heavenly granted and places state before individual. It maintains that state assure harmony, peace, prosperity among people, and it ensures that individuals should contribute to the strengthening of state. So such status notion from the Chinese, who strongly believe that individual rights should be protected by the state rather than recognizing individual right as a separate and independent entity, goes against the Western notion of norms. Therefore, the Chinese system of values and its idea on norms and culture is quite in opposition to Western value-oriented norms. Here now comes the question, why norms are predominantly seen as a Western-oriented and is being contested and opposed by the Chinese. First reason, of course, as I mentioned before, they have their own status definition of norms and values as opposed to Western idea of norms. And secondly, Wan Wanshan has noted that to the Chinese, the normative power West symbolizes and more or less associates it with Western superiority and centralism, and considers West promotion of human rights as a way of showing Western superiority, cultural superiority. So there is the inherent cultural superiority and racial superiority in the Chinese definition of Western-oriented norms. And finally, the Chinese held the view that Western, most of you must have known, that Western nations like US and EU are consistently seen to be interfering in the internal matters of China, and quite naively they believe that West pursues policies to disintegrate CCP and unity of China. In fact, one of the noted writer, Yi Wei Wang, states that it is naive and counterproductive to try to pressure China into Western framework of modern ideas such as democracy and human rights. However, it is to be noted that Chinese views on human rights and its opinion on sovereignty and the Chinese government's practices of human rights have caused conflicts between China and Western countries, and that is further reflected in the case of Tibetan issue. So now the final part of my presentation is how we see Tibet in the whole normative contestation between China and West. There is a strong belief that the Western understanding of Tibet issue and its notion of human rights are quite interrelated. Although most of the responses from the Western nation to China's human rights violation is guided towards violation of cultural rights and religious freedom, which is quite clear from the recent press statement made by President Barack Obama on Tibet issue with Xi Jinping, right? However, such notion on Tibet made author like Wan Wanshan, again, to take a distinct perspective on the issue of Tibet. She propounded that the addressing political status of Tibet is more important than emphasizing on human rights issue, as she believes that Tibet issue is more about statehood and sovereignty rather than about human rights. However, on the other hand, Tochi distinctly relates the issue of Chinese national sovereignty to human rights, because he mentions that to the Chinese, human rights is considered within China's own jurisdiction of sovereignty, thus making China to put forth sovereignty supreme over human rights. In such situation, it is highly possible for China to violate international norms, to which Alan Wakeman interestingly addressed the question whether effort to shame PRC led to an improvement in the protection of human rights. She stated that the purpose of evoking a sense of shamefulness is fundamental, is very important to the international pressure applied to non-violating states, for example, to like China. Although such efforts proved counterproductive and rather than ensuring enduring changes in China. Nevertheless, human rights advocates have sought to shame the government of PRC into compliance with the international norms, but little has improved in the issue of Tibet. That is because Beijing is so very adamant that it is prepared to sacrifice a degree of international prestige for the sake of sovereignty. They believe that the international prestige may enhance the legitimacy of PRC regime, but sovereignty is vital and should never compromise on any level and at any condition. And China has always argued Eurocentrism and Western-oriented human rights approach that has undermined China's handling of human rights issues, and particularly with the Tibet issue. But Western nations, again, like US and EU, for example, are known as one of the leading actors who promote distinctive norms, values, sustainable peace, democracy, human rights, freedom, rule of law. In fact, these norms are one of the most important tenets of Western foreign policy discourse and becomes its international identity. And similarly, promotion of human rights is one of the main foreign policy objectives of most foreign nations who stands for the protection of human value and human dignity. However, interestingly and contradictory, most of the European countries were eager to strengthen their relationship with China, have sidelined human rights at the expense of market value and economic opportunities. Although some scholars might agree that the issue of Tibet is among the key issues of Western normative agenda. Hence, it seems right for me to conclude here that the issue of Tibet has become a significant issue for both Western nations who are widely recognized as the normative power, and to China, because Tibet presents as a litmus test for Western states to prove its consistency in pressing for prioritizing normative agenda, not only with China, but with every country, whichever it's needed. Thank you all.
Yes. Since 1950, after the occupations, the Chinese government has proposed different kind of policy in order to maintain its controls over the Tibet regions and its population. Right? Among various policy, economic factor has played a very significant role in designing China-Tibet policy, and of course in designing the whole issue China-Tibet conflict, and trying to redraw its position over Tibet through these various economic development policies. And not only that, the China economic development policies not only that, the China economic development policies are also aimed to play various other tasks, which include securing national border, maintaining regional stability, and also achieving national integrations of ethnic minority, and last, the economic development of Tibetan populations and the region itself. Right. So before we directly go into the China economic development policies in Tibet, I would like to go to the general discourse on the concept in defining the concept economic development. The subject of the development itself became more relevant after the Second World War due to the formations of many new nations in Asia after the decolonization process. So in the nation building process, economic development occupies a very important space. Right? So the earliest model or the definitions on economic development focus on the utility of massive injections of capital to achieve rapid GDP growth rate, and GDP growth rate. Yeah, and the few important questions that associated with in discourse of defining the concept economic development are: what is the real meaning of economic development? How can one apply economic concepts and the theories to gain a better understanding of development process? Why do some countries develop and other remain poor? And what are the sources of development, and how do we measure development? So, as I said, the subject of development itself became more relevant after the Second World War. So, since 1950, with the whole national developing process, the country were, apart from their political, establishment of political structural system, economic development becomes a major objective. So, if you look at the various economies, their definitions of economic development, economies like Mayer and the Robert maintain that the economic development is a process whereby an economic real national income increase over a long period of time. So here, during that period, the primary concern was the growth of national income, which is measured in terms of GDP or gross national product. So the key objective is, and apart from the Mayer, the economists like Rostow, his growth stage theory, and Howard and the Romer's model, they emphasize on the economic growth, and the key to the economic growth is investments of capital. The problem with this development strategy is that in 1950 and 1960, the experience of the developing countries shows that although the countries have achieved some amounts of economic growth, there were a large number of people who are occupied with the poverty, unemployment, and high mortality rate, and different kind of high risk disease. So in 1970, there were criticisms against that particular strategy, where the economists like Sear questioned that. He argues that it would be strange to call the result development if countries have high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, even if per capita income double. And same as economists like Ansari argue that if a country is able to eradicate poverty and unemployment along with the growth of GNP, only then can genuine economic development to talk of. So in 1950, there was a shift in defining the concept economic development. The measuring of economic development in terms of GDP carry an import. It's equally important, but the economists were more concerned about the eradications of poverty, inequality, unemployment within the context of the growing economy. The discourse on defining economic development further expands in the 1980s and 1990s. The three important definitions on the economic development. First, the World Bank report in 1991 maintained that the challenge of development is to improve the quality of life, which include higher incomes, better educations, equal opportunity, better health, and cleaner environment. Apart from the World Bank report, United Nations in 1994 highlight that human beings are born with a certain potential capability. The purpose of development is to create an environment in which all people can expand their capabilities and opportunity can be enlarged for both present and future generation. And the economist Amartya Sen, 1999, he pointed out that the development required the removal of major source of unfreedom, poverty, tyranny, poor economic opportunities, and systematic social deprivations, neglect of public facility, and intolerance over activity of repressive states. So in 1980s and 1990s, the economies or economic development, when we talk about economic development, it's related more to the promoting or improving the quality of life and giving equal opportunity. The recent definition or discourse in defining the concept economic development is brought by the economists Doctor and Smith. They mentioned that the economic development of development is not purely an economic phenomenon, but rather a multidimensional process. And the three important objectives of economic development are to raise the living levels of people, which include incomes and the consumption level of the food, medical services, education through the relevant growth process. And second is increasing people's freedom to choose by enlarging range of choice variable. That is, varieties of goods and services. Like if we have a better income, we can go to the private hospital, which may provide better facility, like kind of choice. And third is creating conditions conducive to the growth of people as seen through the establishment of social, political, economic system and institutions that promote the human dignity and respect. So the indicators, when we talk about economic development, it does not necessarily reduce to the growth of GDP of a particular country, but it is also important, it is also measured in terms of the development, which include level of poverty, unemployment, environmental protection, equal opportunity, and the proportions of activities in different sectors of economy, which include primary, secondary, and tertiary. And also Human Development Index is considered as very important measurements of the economic development of a particular region or the country. And Human Development Index include longevity, life expectancy, literacy rate, and the standard of living, which is measured mainly through the purchasing power. Now we'll go into the China economic development policies, how the changing natures of the policies. So since 1950, the Chinese government has implemented and carried out various policies for the economic development of Tibet. The discourse of the China the liberation itself is based on the economic. If you look at the white paper, the first few pages is dedicated toward the backwardness of Tibetan economic and traditional economic, and how the Chinese government had improved the economic of Tibet and Tibetan. So the first, starting from the Mao Zedong period, the first two strategy that he carried as far as economic development is concerned, the policy of exceptions and the democratic reform. The policy of exception is that the Mao postponed the democratic reform in central Tibet from 1950 to 1958, and the democratic reform was carried out in the other Tibetan area of Kham and Amdo, because Kham and Amdo. Right. The very reason for this policy of exception was that since Mao, in his paper, he argued that in the selected work of Mao, he actually won his PLA in PLA infiltration in Tibet, about the impacts which may have an impact on the economy of local country, and which may cause a resentment against the Chinese, PLA or the Chinese. So, yeah, so that was the one reason, and second was to Mao firstly he tried to carry a peaceful, try to occupy Tibet through a peacefully. So first he postponed democratic reform policies in Tibet in order to gain the loyalty, in order to accumulate the loyalties of Tibetan elite and the Tibetan. So in order to secure a proper positions on Tibet. However, the failure of this particular strategy resulted in the 1959 uprising, and consequently, Beijing drew another conclusion that the fundamental improvement of national relations depend on the complete emancipation of the working class within each nationality. Through the class struggle, the CCP proclaimed itself no longer a party of the Han, but a leader and spokesman of every poor people in China. The class struggle aimed to win over the poor and the lower class Tibetans from their national and the religious allegiance to the elite. Yeah, true. And through this, and from this democratic reform policy after the 1959, Chinese government has started large numbers of monasteries, and also the main landholding groups, which include monastery, the aristocracy, and the Gandhipadan government in central Tibet, were eliminated by the 1960s, both inside or outside the Thar region. And the closure, expropriations, and the eventual destructions of vast majority of monastic institutions in the period leading up to the advance of the Cultural Revolution in 1966, therefore had effect of wiping out the entire indigenous finance basis of Tibetan economy. Loan was cancelled, estate and the granaries were confiscated. The valuables of collateral of the monasteries, such as gold and precious, were largely sent to China. So, in a way, it had abolished both the traditional economic and the economic system. So, the impact of such policy suddenly resulted in the sharp declines of Thar revenue, and which led to the state providing subsidy for economic growth of Tibet. And since then, the state subsidy began to play a very important role in the economic growth of Tibet. Also under the other policies like under the policies like communist system, the Tibetans were subjected to the Mao radical ideology of eat less and produce more, and coming to an end to the practice of private ownership of land, property, businesses, and the geography granted freedom. So before 1966, there had been over 1,200 small retailers in Lhasa. By 1975, only 67 remained. In Jalung County, 3,000 privately owned wool looms and spinning wool were done away with in the name of cutting off the capitalist tails during that period of time. Apart from these policies, there were also policy, this PRC carried a various policy of agricultural reform, infrastructure development, industrialization. In fact, the agricultural reform has introduced the improved methods of irrigation, which, according to the Professor Dharamshala book, in 1950 brought some kind of improvement in the agricultural production in grain, but this couldn't last long because of there were large number of state farms. The state farms were also established, which cultivate, apart from the barley, cultivated different kinds of vegetables. So around in late 1970s, due to the intensive cultivations and the use of the soil, inappropriate use of the soil, led to the year 1979 harvest a disaster. So there are different kind of various scholars that made different interpretations of analysis on the policies during that period of time. So Professor Dr Nubu, he had made that the main he had studied most of the, in his paper of strategic significance of Tibet, most of the infrastructure development during that period of time, although the Chinese government claimed that it is for the liberation of Tibet, for the economic development of Tibet, there is neither liberation nor progress, but it is for the strategic development. It is securing the border from the imperialists. And Elizabeth Fromm and Alan Colson, Juntufer Dyer see the socialist transformation approach in Tibet as a part of national integrations of ethnic minority program. And Emily and Wang Lixiong, the state farm which was established in the Tibet was, they see it's more of state trying to strengthen its controls over the region and it's part of the state incorporation. The second phase is from 1980s to the 1990s. There were shift in the economic development policies. The first Tibet Walk Forum in March 1980, coupled with the Hu Yaofang visit to Tibet, the government followed the policy titled as land use under the household management and animals belong to the household as a private policy. Under this policy, the peasant household receive an equal share of arable lands in their community according to the size of the household. They manage their productive activities themselves and all harvests belong to the household. So they signed contracts with the government and community for a period of time, and they were not allowed to sell the land but rent it to others for 1 to 3 years. Apart from this policy, the few important policies are pairing up support policy. This policy is a policy model where the central government may develop provinces and cities responsible for providing economic support, which include finance skilled workers projects to the less developed area with which they are paired. Although this policy was introduced and implemented in 1960, it was more vocal in the Tibet since 1980. The two very immediate programs related to this particular policy was population transfer policy and the state financial assistance. So under the population transfer policy, so accordingly, in 1980, the government abolished the administrative restrictions over the migrations and the work permits in Tibet. So consequently, in 1983, 50,000 Han Chinese workers migrated in Tibet, and in 1980 it increased to the 10,000 Chinese households from the neighboring province settles in the Thar urban area. In 1960, it further increased to the 60,000 Han peddlers and craftsmen from varieties of from 20 Chinese provinces and the CTRF at the Tibetan's urban area to work on the new project. And second is the state subsidies. State subsidies still continue to occupy a very important place in the economic growth of Tibet. As far as state subsidies is concerned, the second Tibet Work Forum in 1984 approved 42 major construction projects with an investment of 0.48 billion yuan, and in 1991 under the 8-5-year plan river project, which consumed 2.189 billion yuan of the state investment. And the second major policy is promoting tourism as the gateway of the economic development. It is a new source of revenue for the Tibet economy. So starting from 1981, Lhasa was declared an open area for tourists. In the same year, 1,059 overseas tourists visited Tibet, and the figure was 4 times higher than the total tourists visited Tibet from 1959-79. Due to the political reasons, the capacity to receive tourists and area open for the tourists were limited and controlled at the 1,500 to 2,000 people subsequent year. So in 1984, under the Second Tibet Work Forum, Tourism Corporations of Thar was found as an economic entity which was financially independent and responsible for its own profit and the loss. In 1985, the General Affairs of the State Council issued a report prepared by the State Tourism and the Government of Thar titled Report on the tourism development program of Tibet, requesting the entire related department to render support for realizing tourism as another sectors of booming Tibetan economy. So in 1987, the tourism industry was formally included in the plan for economic and social developments in Tibet, emphasizing its importance to the national economy also. So in 1986, the Tourism Corporation of TAR was changed into Tibet Tourism Administration. And although the government has provided large number of state subsidies, the rural development, which has been lacking behind, there was huge gap between the rural and the urban development. Rural development was lacking far behind. If you look at the various discourse of analysis by the various scholars during that the policies during that period of time was, yeah, I'll make it quick. On the one section, the scholar like Goldstein and Yashang Huang, they argue that the Tibetan really, during that period, the Tibetan population were really lacking in terms of skills and education qualification. Therefore, the government policy of population transfer was like genuinely try to help the Tibetans and improve the economy. But on other sides, again, like Professor Darnobu and Amaru, they argue that this policy trying to assimilate Tibetans as a part of the national integrations of ethnic minority. 1990 to 2000, it's called, I put it as an era of stability and development. The number of cases, including 1987 to 89 protests, China-Tibet negotiation, international campaigns for Tibet issue by the Dalai Lama had played a significant role in modifying China economic development policy from the previous year. In 1989, the Politburo Standing Committee held a special meeting on Tibet affair, where the then Chinese President Hu Jintao released a document titled Meeting Minutes of the Politburo Standing Committee on Tibet affair. So according to the document, the central task of the central government in Tibet was to maintain stability and developed economy. So the document mentioned that foundations of social stability, however, is the economic development. So they had built up this hypothetical analysis of direct relationship between development and stability. Development and stability, this has become a kind of watchword by the Chinese leader on Tibet policy since then. There was different kind of interpretation related to the stabilities and development. Right? Pittman B. Porter, in his book, he tried to, when he talks about stability and development, he tried to bring out the Premier Li Peng, his remarks about making a direct linkage between lack of economic development in Tibet with the potential for the separatist economic and the separatist activities. And Robert Berner, he emphasized more on the Chinese leader linking religion, superstitions, and its impact obstacles, the kind of its cause and obstacles for the China policy of national integrations of the ethnic minority. So the cornerstone of the government policy, central government policy, was economic growth and the modernization. So economic growth means it's increasing the GDP rates. So if you look, the role of China economic development policies in Tibet is that it's tried to, the Chinese government has published a large, from 1992 around more than 14 white papers. So if you look at the white paper, every white paper, be it on the regional autonomy of ethnic minority or human rights on Tibet, and obviously there are some papers directly related to the economic development of Tibet. So the first few pages of all these white paper is reserved for the backwardness of writing the backwardness of the traditional Tibetan economy and how it has improved and developed under the leadership of the Chinese, the PRC. So it tried to redefine and rewrite the China-Tibet conflict. And another role it plays is an important role in rewriting the positions of China position, try to legitimize China rules in Tibet through this development. So when we type of economic development and project in Tibet, most of the website of Chinese government directly provide the GDP growth rate or the incomes of the per capita incomes of the urban area, which is high, and GDP growth rate is high. So it's tried to portray the PRC of China as the developer and as a gift, and the development that Tibet has as a gift of development from the China and liberated Tibet from the backwardness and exploitation. Therefore, the Tibetans should feel grateful towards the China. And many policies related to the economic development are also aimed to secure a national border from the threat of foreign infiltration, maintaining regional stability and the national integration of ethnic minority. And the economic development of Tibet and Tibetan was least considered. Although they talked about economic development, the improvements of improving the economic conditions of Tibetan observed within the larger objective of achieving national unity, territorial integrity, sovereignty, in the sovereignty. And last few assessment. China-Tibet economic development still is the growth oriented that was during 1950 and 60. It still focused on the GDP as the key indicators of economic development of Tibet. So rural development was still lacking. It has been lagging behind. It's still lagging behind. And there's lack of human development. The gap between GDP growth rate and the human development remains a major concern. And if you look at the United Nations UNDP reports, Tibet comes under the least developed regions in China. Economic development policy are subjected and subjugated to the concern to the national unity, regional stability, and are supervised by central authority. All the policies are. And there's also lack of Tibetan participations in the major decision-making body like State Council and the National Development and Reform Commission. So the biggest challenge of China economic development policies is getting market for local production, enlarging Tibetan participations in the designing and implementation of economic development policy, determining how to target funding and state subsidies better to address poverty. Unemployment has been a critical challenge for the central government of Beijing in drawing the sustainable economic development policies in Tibet. Thank you.
주원이 주어 당고 대ten지라도나다 치매 유도나 수익견에 대해서 주원이부터 좀 주어 당고디 지 가슈라 한테 키라니 게 presentation 디스온소 the international relation, the international law, human rights, the naloria, yanang ditaji kashura argument jik cultural relativism di shukchambochi, onto di shake you in the sunsun. Tayang jik chochine argument shamba kario resuvina, jik that the consensus Eurocentric approach to the international law, human rights. In the Lianjik argument medani yungora. The argument dina no lementa mangu yungora. The menta you have the sujo desha, dina abo. The Kasura Niga, Medun Chetuya argument in the point Karakar those you had picture. And it one you with the Domusla and the Disonso. Yadane, Yana Vishune, Puranjo Jolia, subsidy de Jomare. The subsidy the Ranjo Jong, such a Nangso in ere, Daganangshi Shinja in ere, Daganangshi Puranjo Jong to say a day in the subsidy the Cheshire, the Halam Yajukuchu. 표현하죠 좀 조선 계속 급주 저기 야나 중에 있는 것도 봐. 나가 능시 망실 표현하죠 좀 그래서 디제리아 아니 낭송으로 차샤비는 계속 죽주리 뒤에 접게 저기 subsidy 있는 것도 Ini Xinjiang 샤샤브니 가족납주 ngani nga sum tinde subsidy nang do. The subsidy digam je mangu tegu yobi ne berang jo jong nang ya. Tegu yobi ne da ada kirang ke sunsu UNDP ke Human Development Index na te yundu yana ke Xinjiang chame na ne kyoshu di da berang jo jong de do ga dina ne life expectancy ne de bina tanga no men halam tukju mid 60s tinde sha ani dina loria ani 당능시 illiteracy rate so 시부터부터 다디 용 거야 그지 subsidy digam 첨부 되게 유네야 배나리 할게 누구면 됐다 자나 statistic 내 모임 그동안 경제소 가르르 공도
that is state subsidies like state subsidies like the mangsho khawa tangla treasury sector gi state subsidy di consume mangsho chura and treasury sector nangi the sector mangbo yora including nanglo mangbo chudu mala government administrations and agency yora di consume mangsho chur ta khalana state subsidy mangbo chigya yang construction business na tanglo the construction business na Tibetan population di ta yarke human development di in gap chumbo khare re samna nge khasam ka dulana human development ko yarke tang khwal la source so di khalana education wa education gangla kisi ta orishna ya 6 to 7% which grade samsra the subsidy provided in the dose non menara ani ta odi jerni ani education di ta main source do education gan invest sukshmo ma chitu ani skill labor in a Nanjula still we are still lacking behind in terms of skill labor. The Nanjo promote to Tibet railway nangla laga chingi English high level ki laga chingi sama kana race low level sama Tibetan race current Tibetan skill yo mare lejo. So the state subsidies is concern jungi di amount construction business ya ani government ki laga chingi sukchumbu jura dil preferential policy gani ya laja yu sukchumbu chok that laja ya the odi digi the expenditure central government ki thar region expenditure then expenditure mangbuchik dela dusha China believes in economic development. They focus on economic development, and they also believe that one should have economic development before imposing human rights or before having human rights in China. And EU also agrees and believes that human rights will come with economic development in China. So it kind of
Niki kyangi toward normena tanda China the Western Koran niki argument tuyenji kare tiwara aleta argument mangoji lo re ta ni lendi digyo ma hamaso ne tanda niki readings mangoji na kare house lanamde Ganagi the West la ta cho chura kadune Quran so foreign policy ki discourse na against chigwa gumde de kadune West relate kharichi na imperialist race kunzu colonist race later ye Quran so ta ngazo ngaran so ki peba ki argument da invade chure peba invade ni ne Quran so ki kadune international system mangbuji UNO penashashana ra in ITO mangbuji international system mangbuji western oriented later western oriented na thanda ni ki shade na norms international norms mangbuji follow chore kana kisi cross global power chawena tindi global power chala kunzu ki international norms mangbuji follow choda international norms mangbuji cross killing choma khajina cross tangbo ra idea kare the west ki oriented resha the colonist race kunzu imperialist kunzu di chire la ora the indi jindu samaminde argument dinde chitedu sambala niki tanda readings na khara house na gyana da western Quran ge argument chaji kari chaido na tanda gyana ki ye Quran su gi argument dinde mangbutte ne ra Quran su khanda ta global power chik chala lungba paru interaction le ore ne sungsa dinde la lungba paru interaction le la of course western nyam de le ora thangbo powerful charge nyam le ora dinde shindu kunso ki ideas mangbuchi except chuwa ki ora Dinde ta janagi nyejarang Quran sugi Taiwan do shashuneda Taiwan la kharichidu landa digi aire de tanda Quran su reflect chidu Taiwan nanglo namde Taiwan gi tanda Quran su separate the country in lagora ine janagi Taiwan the parties lagora dinalo Taiwan the Quran sugi lungba mangbo chigi binde Taiwan janagi party la ji sue lanta Kwanzuki shuk kari gyawalana gyamigi, di nashi tanda legitimacy dagarang la tungidu shuk mangbo kari gyedulana Africa lumba mangbo shila, third world countries lumba mangbo shila Kwanzuki, the economic incentive tin digida, nganzu infrastructure di build chigi, nganzu gi dindila khasa, investment chigi, the investment shuk chumbu chi tidu samba, pina shidana lumba, peji lumba nis nyejarang, African ki lumba nis nyejarang kunzuki, nyeni Taiwan lani lumba tsangma sangyan kelen gore, jesu kunzuki Taiwan is a part of China lani kelen sar, but di gamiki shukche economic incentive khali khali tiki kunzuki kharshikto lumba mangbochi Kuranzuki wala legitimacy lentwa chida, and pina chashana UN on na nyegi tanda sungsa, UN on Kuranzuki norms mangbochi kelen go mare sungsa. Ine UN on na ine nganzuki ya hosta du sambala lumba third world vote mangshu Africa la yura African nation mangboshira oti Kuranzuki tanda target di Africa nanglo legitimacy bill che try chigida dinde chidu sambala yana ki chitane chashi do de tagaran rida economic incentive shukchubushte ni Kuranzu lumba mangbochi Kuranzu la gyapalela. That means Kuranzuki forces khasa western ki notion de la shukchubuchi ani jama ta khari against chugo united dinde chiro wachi rala kunzu tanda ni shukki inde
지원이 가면 사진 찍는 시대 죠. 근데 사진 당보의 취미네 된다. 취미기 된다 된다 EU기 된듯이네 가서 compromise share 다 그런 식이다 because of economic dependency. 그런 게 fact 온 된듯이 economic dependency 거고치 차이 된듯이 때나라 this 그런 거 argument validate 소 차그랬어 무슨. For example 된다 export 인데 import 인데 하나 가지고 대규모 매출에 이제 아니 도마트링나 서지신 지라 the way you began, yeah, like you began with the whole evolution of development theory, right? But I didn't see much of a connection between the whole development theory's evolution and the concept of development theory used by China. There is this little bit disconnection. So maybe you are trying to show that, okay, there is a difference between the two concepts used by the China and the one used by the Western concept here. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and you mentioned that, like, for example, in Tibet, like rural did not develop. Basically, it performed very badly. I thought it would be good to do a relative studies, especially during the period of 1980s and 90s, because during that time, 78 onwards, world transition was taking place in China. So, and China is known for its transition. It's become very successful. And what are the factors or ingredients of this transition is, for example, they have used some elements which are unique to China only. For example, the dual track system, household responsibility system, the household farm system, TVS, or the CIS. So I don't know, why didn't China use these models in Tibet aspect? If you could look into that, then you could find more answers to your question. Thank you.
I brought the general discourse in defining the concept economic development because it's shift from the growth-oriented GDP growth rate towards the human welfare, improvement of quality of life. So now, economic development doesn't associate exclusively with the GDP. It's not defined exclusively in terms of GDP, but also include the human development index play a very important role in defining. So why I brought this general discourse is that I find that the China, as far as China economic development policies in Tibet, it still with what happened in the 1950s and 60s in the most of the developing countries. Their concentration is more on the growth oriented, because of which the criticism which in 1970 there were a lot of criticisms against the considering GDP growth rate as the only indicator of economic growth rate. Because of the emphasis on the GDP growth rate, there were a large number of people still struggling with the poverty, unemployment, and all the health issue. So same case, somewhere I find some Tibet situation somewhat same. The government focused too much on the economic growth rather than the overall development of the population. as far as household responsibility systems and dual track, I'm not sure about that. As far as the household responsibility system, I have mentioned that land use, agriculture, and I have mentioned about that particular, but I haven't looked much on the TBS. So.
My question is for Chimudunla. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned about EU's policies towards China on human rights, on the grounds of human rights. So is it a uniform policy by the EU members, or does it differ from member to member, from state to state? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. EU member state does not have one common policy on human rights towards China. It differs from state to state, and I have also mentioned that institutions also there's a differences in institution as well. Because in case of European Parliament, it takes a stronger stand on human rights, whereas European Commission, their position is more related to economic stand.
My question is to Chime. You said that with regard to EU's stand on human rights and with regard to Tibet, unless and until there is changes from within China, it would be impossible to improve the Tibetan human rights condition in Tibet. So what do you mean, what changes do you expect within the China? And my second question is that from the Tibetan exile, thank you.
When I say changes should bring from within China, changes I mean democratization of China itself, and then only it look into human rights condition. Otherwise, it has been China has been very critical about Western stance on human rights and also their criticism on them.
Sorry, we are out of time now. Did you show me she must stay in the Tangan to the daily shoot to Bushman and Sense now, any very cheshire, which in any Shella person the Tango and Gamashu Resha and choosing you for the Shella person in it, and to the Kario she's to me to ship.
Did you show the numbers of the Jumalo Mara Norway, Tibet Logic, then numbers of Dixune, Lorella, the new Chubustine, Sugar and Nishu stance, Chanting, Cheche, Jumal Norway, and numbers of Nazuki, Chage Harrisna, numbers of proposal, the PIP, voilà. Future plans accept Cheche Council presentation, the accept Chesus, and the Gonzulin Cherry and panel didn't discuss here. The Council the Mojor Marta can I propose George to say that you go Marta? Can presentation she told less and the Gonzuli Chuma Ibeina at Pimidixul Ya, time Ibeina, Councilman Chu, Nishu, Sunju, and the number of things pure. This one, Hamara and the Shudio Kabla, and has a Kangata Sedejo, Pinaro Nashu, Koran to subsidize secret. And Utusuna, Kozagashi, Shaladi, and Utusunani, Norvella, your Nanachi. And then Choniga Tone contribution in the Yawar, number of the Kuchi, even there were number of things. This one, 저도 야시다도 아주말로 난 인간데 그저 시기 내가 시기에 이제 난 내가 때서 요 공으로 와야 인간데 그거 가고 이제 제가 참여 나 감정이 아니고 그냥 시기 염색하면 친구가 인간데 그거 봐라 제가 시에도 샤우스도 하고데 리소스는 뭐需求这些应该我那个这个脾气有多好的什么저게 투에 뭐 이무 장신 난 참에 감시라야 나서 영화를 야우스나 한데 유치 시작을 남마 유야에 나를 경험을 했었는 거지 나도 소미야 디 하수 루시 상황 띵사고 요가 문제를 포함해 상황을 깨도 그치 다른 쪽에 소침목을 쉬고야 돼 그게 인자 염시 수를 인자 남도 쉬는 말도 남주인의 Dharamshala 공안의 지리시 전부를 또 도와주고 있어요. 남자의 무슨 말이죠? 그죠?